first big expansion of NATO, 99. Second big expansion, 2004. Then April 2008 is when we announced that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. This gentleman is talking about what happened in 2014. 2014 is when the crisis in Ukraine breaks out, not the big war. As he pointed out, 2022 is when the war breaks out. February 24th, 2022. That's the war. That's when the Russian army invades. 2014, February 2014 is when we help overthrow the democratically elected leader of Ukraine. And that's when the crisis starts. We don't call it a war because not that many people were killed to categorize it as a war. But that 2014 is when the trouble starts. And the putsch, as you described it, when Yanukovsky is overthrown, is the source of big trouble. That's when the Russians take the Crimean Peninsula, 2014. And that's when the civil war in eastern Ukraine, in the famous Donbass, breaks out. That's 2014. Then 8 years later is when the war breaks out. And there's, I think, no question that in 2014, the putsch, is, you put it, where Yanukovsky was overthrown, mattered greatly to the Russians, because the Russians saw this as NATO expansion into Europe becoming a really serious threat. Let me make a couple points on this. First of all, there is a widespread belief, contrary to my view, that Putin invaded Ukraine, because he wanted to conquer all of Ukraine and make it part of a greater Russia. And many people believe, this is certainly true in Europe today, many people believe that he will eventually take all of Ukraine, and then he will conquer countries in Eastern Europe, reestablish the Soviet Empire in effect, and threaten Western Europe as well. And I believe this argument is completely wrong. And I think Putin has no interest in taking all of Ukraine. And the reason is, it gets back to my point about nationalism. If you look at the demographics of Ukraine, not the demographics, the ethnic distribution in Ukraine, the eastern 2/5 of Ukraine are filled with Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. Okay? The western 3/5 of Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians. And Putin surely understands that that would be jumping into a hornet's nest. As I like to say, Putin invading Western Ukraine would be like trying to swallow a porcupine. It would be remarkably foolish. Let me make a couple more points about this. A lot of people think that he's interested in conquering all of Europe. The Soviets dominated Eastern Europe, a huge swath of Europe, as most of us in this room know, during the Cold War. It was actually a nightmare. They had to put down a rebellion in East Germany in 1953. They had to invade Hungary in 1956. They had to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. They almost had to invade Poland 3 times. And then they had to deal with the Albanians and the Romanians. And you all know what happened with the Yugoslavs. This is nationalism. The idea that the Soviets or the Russians want to occupy a huge swath of territory and run the politics of that country. This is why Donald Trump doesn't put boots on the ground. You know what happens when you put boots on the ground? The locals rise up. I learned this during the Vietnam War. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975. Principal lesson I took away from that conflict is stay out of places like that. We thought we were fighting communism in Vietnam. We weren't fighting communism. We were fighting nationalism. The Vietnamese didn't want us coming in and telling them what color toilet paper they could use. They wanted to run their own life, and I don't blame them one bit. So you want to stay out of these places. The Russians have figured this out. Furthermore, as you've surely noticed, the Russians have had a devil of a time conquering the eastern 20% or the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. This is not the Wehrmacht, right? This is not Heinz Guderian's army that's primed to run to, the beaches at Dunkirk. They can't even conquer all Ukraine. And again, they'd be nuts to do that. So I don't see a real threat from the Russians. However, I do think you raise a very important point. And that is that you have this area called Kaliningrad, right? Which the Russians can't get directly to, even if they come out of Belarus, right? And they have to go through that gap. And the question is, what if Kaliningrad is threatened or attacked and the Russians feel they have to go into Kaliningrad to protect those people?
Or that they stimulate a situation in which they then justify it.
Okay, that's a possibility too. And then, as you surely know, another scenario which is relevant to what you're talking about is where, let's say, the Russian minority runs into problems in one of the Baltic states, like Latvia or Estonia, right? And there's some perceived persecution of the Russian minority, and the Russians feel that they have a responsibility to go in and take care of those people. I think the general problem that you're identifying, right, which is different than the one I started with, the big Russian push toward Dunkirk, throwing that out. The problem that you identify in the Baltic states is a very real problem, right? It's a very dangerous situation. And your question is to who's going to go in there and stop them? Because, as you all know, those three Baltic states are all in NATO. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are all in NATO. And they all have, therefore, an Article 5 guarantee. An Article 5 guarantee means if they get whacked by the Russians, we basically have a responsibility, we meaning the United States and all the other members of NATO, to do something about it. But if that happens, I think we're really going to at least hesitate. Do you know what I mean? And by the way, this all gets back to the Iran business. Given the situation in Iran, if we get bogged down in Iran, right, and let's say there's a crisis in East Asia over Taiwan, right, we're stretched remarkably thin here. And just to take it a step further, you all understand that President Trump has decided to reintroduce old-style colonialism or old-style imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela. He's going to run Venezuela. Can you believe that? He thinks their oil is our oil. He's going to run Cuba, run Nicaragua, right? He's fooling around with Greenland and Canada. So we're deeply involved in the politics of the Western Hemisphere in ways that we haven't been in the past. And remember, he had that giant armada that's now in the Middle East was in the Caribbean before it went there. So you've got the Western Hemisphere, you've got the Middle East. God knows when we'll get out of Iran and how that one will end. Then you got Ukraine, and then you have East Asia. And as I said before, if you look at our manufacturing base and you start looking at the assets that we have available, this is General Kane telling Trump, you want to think long and hard before you jump into this quagmire.